on the part of those States and this district would shorten the war more than 87 days and thus be an actual saving of expense? 4 days after transmitting the message, the President called together the delegations in Congress from the border slave States, and in a long and earnest personal interview, in which he repeated and enforced the arguments of his message, urged upon them the expediency of adopting his plan, which he assured them he had proposed in the most friendly spirit, and with no intent to injure the interests or wound the sensibilities of the slave States. On the day following this interview, the House of Representatives adopted the joint resolution by more than a two-thirds vote, ayes 89, nays 31. Only a very few of the border State members had the courage to vote in the affirmative. The Senate also passed the joint resolution by about a similar party division not quite a month later, the delay occurring through press of business rather than unwillingness. As yet, however, the scheme was tolerated rather than heartily endorsed by the more radical elements in Congress. Stephens, the cynical Republican leader of the House of Representatives, said: "I confess I have not been able to see what makes one side so anxious to pass it, and the other side so anxious to defeat it. I think it is about the most diluted milk and water gruel proposition that was ever given to the American nation." But the bulk of the Republicans, though it proposed no immediate practical legislation, nevertheless voted for it as a declaration of purpose in harmony without a pending measure, and as being, on the one hand, a tribute to anti-slavery opinion in the North, and, on the other, an expression of liberality toward the border States. The concurrent measure of practical legislation was a bill for the immediate emancipation of the slaves in the District of Columbia on the payment to their loyal owners of an average sum of $300 for each slave, and for the appointment of a commission to assess and award the amount. The bill was introduced early in the session, and its discussion was much stimulated by the President's special message and joint resolution. Like other anti-slavery measures, it was opposed by the Democrats and supported by the Republicans, but with trifling exceptions, and by the same majority of two-thirds was passed by the Senate on April 3, and the House on April 11, and became a law by the President's signature on April 16. The Republican majority in Congress, as well as the President, was thus pledged to the policy of compensated abolishment, both by the promise of the joint resolution and the fulfillment carried out in the district bill. If the representatives and senators of the border slave States had shown a willingness to accept the generosity of the government, they could have avoided the pecuniary sacrifice which overtook the slave owners in those States not quite 3 years later. On April 14, in the House of Representatives, the subject was taken up by Mr. White of Indiana, at whose insistence a select committee on emancipation, consisting of 9 members, a majority of whom were from border slave States, was appointed; and this committee on July 16 reported a comprehensive bill authorizing the President to give compensation at the rate of $300 for each slave to any one of the States of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri that might adopt immediate or gradual emancipation. Some subsequent proceedings on this subject occurred in Congress in the case of Missouri, but as to the other States named in the bill, either the neglect or open opposition of their people and representatives and senators prevented any further action from the committee. Meanwhile, a new incident once more brought the question of military emancipation into sharp public discussion. On May 9, General David Hunter, commanding the Department of the South, which consisted mainly of some 60 or 70 miles of the South Carolina coast between North Edisto River and Warsaw Sound, embracing the famous Sea Island cotton region, which fell into Union hands by the capture of Port Royal in 1861, issued a military order which declared Slavery and martial law in a free country are altogether incompatible. The persons in these three States, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, heretofore held as slaves, are therefore declared forever free. The news of this order, coming by the slow course of ocean mails, greatly surprised Mr. Lincoln, and his first comment on it was positive and emphatic. "No commanding general shall do such a thing upon my responsibility without consulting me," he wrote to Secretary Chase. 3 days later, May 19, 1862, he published a proclamation declaring Hunter's order entirely unauthorized and void, by adding: "I further make known that whether it be competent for me, as Commander in Chief of the Army and Navy, to declare the slaves of any State or States free, whether at any time, in any case, it shall have become a necessity indispensable to the maintenance of the government to exercise such supposed power, are questions which, under my responsibility, I reserve to myself, and which I cannot feel justified in leaving to the decision of commanders in the field. These are totally different questions from those of police regulations in armies and camps." This distinct reservation of executive power, an equally plain announcement of the contingency which would justify its exercise, was coupled with a renewed recital of his plan, an offer of compensated abolishment, and reinforced by a powerful appeal to the public opinion of the border slave States. "I do not argue," continued the proclamation. "I beseech you to make the arguments for yourselves. You cannot, if you would, be blind to the signs of the times. I beg of you a calm and enlarged consideration of them, ranging, if it may be, far above personal and partisan politics. This proposal makes common cause for a common object, casting no reproaches upon any. It acts not the Pharisee. The change it contemplates would come gently as the dews of heaven, not rending or wrecking anything. Will you not embrace it? So much good has not been done, by one effort, in all past time, as in the providence of God it is now your high privilege to do. May the vast future not have to lament that you have neglected it." This proclamation of President Lincoln's naturally created considerable and very diverse comment, but much less than would have occurred had not military events intervened, which served in a great degree to absorb public attention. At the date of the proclamation, McClellan, with the Army of the Potomac, was just reaching the Chickahominy in his campaign toward Richmond. Stonewall Jackson was about beginning his startling raid into the Shenandoah Valley, and Halleck was pursuing his somewhat leisurely campaign against Corinth. On the day following the proclamation, the victorious fleet of Farragut reached Vicksburg in its first ascent of the Mississippi. Congress was busy with the multifarious work that crowded the closing weeks of the long session, and among this congressional work the debates and proceedings upon several measures of positive and immediate anti-slavery legislation were significant signs of the times. During the season and before it ended, acts or amendments were passed prohibiting the army from returning fugitive slaves, recognizing the independence and sovereignty of Haiti and Liberia, providing for carrying into effect the treaty with England to suppress the African slave trade, restoring the Missouri Compromise, and extending its provisions to all United States territories, greatly increasing the scope of the Confiscation Act in freeing slaves actually employed in hostile military service, and giving the President authority, if not in express terms, at least by easy implication, to organize and arm negro regiments for the war. But between the President's proclamation and the adjournment of Congress military affairs underwent a most discouraging change. McClellan's advance upon Richmond became a retreat to Harrison's Landing. Halleck captured nothing but empty forts at Corinth. Farragut found no coöperation at Vicksburg, and returned to New Orleans, leaving its hostile guns still barring the commerce of the great river. Still worse, the country was plunged into